has another talk coming up, so he'll go into the light then. But we're going to talk a little bit now about basically the other environmental management factors. I'm Joyce Latimer. I'm the Extension Specialist for Greenhouse Crops located in Blacksburg, and I'm basically your go-to person for questions. I say I'm one of them, and Chris is the other one. And a lot of times when it gets down to hydroponics, I refer him to Chris anyway. If you don't know who to talk to, call me, because I can certainly figure out who you need to be talking about. So what we're going to talk about today is how we use the greenhouse to optimize plant health. You use the greenhouse for that purpose. So we're going to talk about keeping the environmental factors in balance. That's what's most important. You can get away with a high temperature if everything else is, taking care of the plant. But when you get things out of balance, then you have more issues. And we're also, Neil has talked about the proper balance of nutrients and acidity. Space, we're going to talk a little bit more about that this afternoon at John Schuyler's, not so much me, but John is going to go through his production practices. And then of course you want to keep things free of diseases and pests. So when we talk about the environment, we're talking about, of course, light levels. That's one of the big ones for plant growth. It affects growth and quality of the plant. We're going to talk about temperature, air quality, and movement. And we're going to talk about relative humidity and how that impacts both growth and disease pressure. And what it boils down to is knowing what your plant needs. And you'll hear John talk a little bit this afternoon on his production about how some crops, like romaine, need things a little bit different than some of your other lettuces. So you're going to need to know what the crop needs, and then you're going to know that your greenhouse has those capabilities, or that you can afford to give your greenhouse those capabilities. That will direct your crop choices. If you can't grow it right, you don't want to be growing it. Okay? Let's talk a little bit about light intensity. Like I said, Neil's going to talk a bit more about this. I want to talk about it in terms of the big picture. And Neil's going to talk to you about units. Still, a lot of our greenhouse people are using foot candles to measure light, and light is basically, foot candles is basically a visual light thing. It's based on the camera industry, film industry. But just to give you a perspective, full sun in Virginia in the middle of the summer is about 10,000 foot candles. That just gives you a baseline. When you walk into the greenhouse, depending on how much stuff you have up here, depending on what your glazing is, you're going to lose 30 to 50% of that light. And we'll basically, Neil has brought a light meter. We'll be able to see that in the greenhouse this afternoon. Hopefully our sun will hold so you'll be able to get a good clear picture of what's the difference between inside and outside. The light intensity, of course, is important for plant growth in terms of maintaining starch storage, and it also keeps the plant compact. Which you really don't want a stretched out lettuce head. You want things compact. You get into low light, which a lot of times we get into in the winter. And that's why Neil's going to talk to you about supplemental lighting in addition to our normal sunlight. You can get a lot of stem stretch. The other thing I'll caution you on is being careful about moving plants from a low light, in particular, a low light to a high light. This is scald. This is just sun scald on these peppers that were moved from a greenhouse to outdoors. If you're moving seedlings from a seed tray in the shed and then moving those into the greenhouse, you can get similar damage. You need to acclimate plants slowly, gradually, not necessarily slowly, but gradually from a low light condition to a high light condition. And the same in reverse. If you take a plant that's been growing outdoors in full sun, you bring it into the greenhouse with less light, then it's going to have a tendency to stretch. So it's just understanding how these factors affect the growth and the quality of your plants. When we talk about light quality, it's basically light quality. And again, Neil is going to talk a little bit more about what's important about photosynthetically active radiation. That's what the plant sees. Very different from what we see. But that's what the plant sees and what it needs. And how Neil will also talk about how the supplemental lighting sources vary in these different light systems. What I want to point out is how plant spacing affects your light quality. These colors, if you have a lot of some of the red light, it will keep your plant short. But if the plants filter the red light, those leaves collect it, they like it. So the leaves that are under them won't get the red light. They get more of the far red light. And so therefore it causes the plant to stretch. This you see most often if you're hanging anything over top of the greenhouse. You're hanging baskets and say floriculture production. Or we actually were seeing an operation this past weekend where they had a tray system set up over top of the benches. Now they kind of had it on the edges, and they basically said, yes, it does reduce our production. It will slow down. This was a cut flower operation in hydroponics, but it would slow down the production of the snapdragons on the floor by about 1 week. But what they said was that added 5,000 square feet of additional production by hanging those trays. And that definitely compensated them for the slower production on their snapdragons. So again, you can do it. You just have to look at what the trade-offs are and know what the effect is on the plants you're growing. Temperature, of course, plants do have minimums and maximums, and they have optimums. You want to be careful that you're staying in those ranges. And excessive heat, of course, will reduce growth. In fact, there was a study reported a few years ago that said temperatures as high as, I think it was 105 degrees, which you can get in the greenhouse without too much trouble, can shut down photosynthesis for 3 days. 3 days in a leaf crop is a major reduction in growth. So temperature is a very important part of what you're doing in the greenhouse, what you're trying to manage in the greenhouse. And of course you know that low temperature can also stress those plants. So when we talk about greenhouse automation, typically environmental controls is the first automation. And hydroponics is probably going to be your irrigation system. Like Neil said, or Chris said it as well, you lose that water flow, you've lost a lot. And we talked to John about that. He's had some issues with power outages that cause a reduction. Chris also deals with the Department of Corrections. They don't have anybody watching their greenhouses on the weekends. So if anything goes down, they lose everything they've got in there because these plants, that's all they have is the water you're putting in there. So the first thing you're going to want to guard in a hydroponic operation is going to be your irrigation system. But then you're going to want to make sure those environmental controls are automated. Just makes your life easier. I don't know how many people I know with small greenhouses, well, I got to leave work now, the sun's out, I got to go open up my greenhouse before things cook. So you don't want to do that. You want to have it automated. And basically for your environmental control, you've got to have an aspirated thermostat. That means that it has the air from the greenhouse being blown in on that thermostat. So it's not near the edges or not up high where it's getting a different kind of temperature than what your plant is seeing. You want to measure the temperature where your plants are, and you want the same air that they are under. Electronic thermostats are a good bit more not cost efficient, but more energy efficient than the old mechanical ones. So go a little bit high end on that. It'll pay for itself. Greenhouse heating options, there are a lot of different options out there, but there really aren't that many we use. The larger your operation, you're going to be wanting to look at boiler systems, and a lot of times we'll do that with either the thin pipes, or more often the bigger operations are going in the floor. Again, depends on what you're growing. If you're growing hydroponic on channels up in the air, having floor heating is not going to do you that much good. So one of the things that people are coming back with is putting the heating cables underneath the channels. And a lot of them will actually curtain those benches so that they keep that air under there. So what you really want to pay attention to is the temperature of your root zone. That's going to be the most important for your growth. Smaller operations, we're still using mostly unit heaters. You can get a unit hydronic heater that will actually give you water. So you can use the thin pipes or the thin floor or the under the bench. So that's also available in a small scale. Again, you're going to have to look at the economics. Here in Virginia, we don't have a lot of natural gas, so most people are using propane, and obviously that price varies a lot from year to year. So I gave you a handout on energy efficiency. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. We will talk about it some out at the greenhouse, looking at the structure that John has and some of the things he's done or that he could do to increase his energy efficiency. So I'm going to talk probably a little bit more about ventilation and cooling. Ventilation is basically bringing in fresh air. It can be from a passive system, or it can be by fans and vents that actually pull that air into your greenhouse. We think about it in terms of temperature control, but as you've heard a couple of times already today, a lot of the reason for doing this is for humidity control. We want the fresh air, we want that carbon dioxide to keep these plants growing, but we need humidity control in that greenhouse to keep them out of disease episodes. Again, it can be mechanical or it can be a passive system where you're counting on natural airflow and setting up venting systems that enhance that natural airflow. Just a couple of mechanical systems. The most typical one is an exhaust fan on one end of the greenhouse and a wall vent on the other. They're thermostatically controlled in stages. You might have one that opens up before both of them open up. The fan might be low speed, then go to high speed, so that it's based on the temperature and the demand for the venting in the greenhouse, based on temperature. The other thing we do to control temperature is use cell pads, or call it it's a pad system. A couple different things out there, but mostly they're cellulose pads. We've got some new concrete enhanced ones that are a little more long lasting. But basically you're going to use a system where you run water down these pads, and then those fans on the other end are pulling the air through the water to cool off that air. So that's an active cooling system for a greenhouse. The other thing about venting, we mentioned a little bit, is venting out the hot air or the humid air. So these, a lot of times, and what you really want to look at having put in your greenhouse, especially if you have a crop like tomatoes, or even lettuces, they'll put off a lot of transpiration, a lot of water overnight. And you want to be able to vent that out just as quick as you can. And this allows you to vent without cooling the entire greenhouse. You have a fan on one end and a vent on the other, and it just pulls that air through the greenhouse without mixing it completely with the air below. So you're pulling out the humidity. And basically you're going to want to set this on a humidistat so that it runs. You don't want it on a humidistat at night. You want a timer and a humidistat. Otherwise it's going to run all night. And then your heating cost is going to go through the roof because you're pulling out all the hot air. But what I said about poinsettia is they actually found that they came in just before dark and vented the greenhouse, vented out as much of that humid air as they could, and heated the air back up. They had a much drier system overnight, and it reduced their diseases to the point where they had, like half the fungicide applications that they had to have. So it basically paid for itself in the energy costs by saving them on fungicide costs. So it's definitely a good practice for these crops because of that humid air. We're going to talk a little bit about what that humid air does. There are a lot of passive systems out there, anything from an open roof system to roof vents. The wall vents roll up or roll down, and these also can be automatic or manual. Again, the more you can automate, the better control you'll have and the easier your life will be. Just a couple of examples. This is one of those roll down walls that basically just drops down. You have to pay attention to fit, because this obviously is going to be less energy efficient in the wintertime. So you'll look at having a good overlap here so that you can kind of seal that down in the winter. But this allows you to vent naturally during the summer. It does not exclude pests. And typically you'll see that's an issue. Even dogs, cats, larger animals can come over this if they want to. Chris mentioned screening, and this is a natural ventilation system with insect screening on the outside. Anytime you use insect screening, you are reducing airflow. So you need to size it according to your fans. In other words, you wouldn't just put it over the vent of a pad and fan system. You want to make it bigger. You want to have it bigger than the greenhouse to give you more surface area to pull that air through. And there are some good calculations, some good publications out of NC State telling you how to do that. So if you're interested in doing screening, check with me. I'll get you tied up with the right people on that so that you get that size correctly. Otherwise, you're going to burn out your fans. So that's an expense you don't want to do. The other thing is the size of the screen. Obviously, the smaller the screen, the more insects it's going to screen out, but the more airflow it's going to reduce, and so the more you're going to have to build it out to use the fans in the greenhouse. You may even have to increase your fan power in order to get the airflow you need. Shade cloth. I want to talk about this a little bit. We use it for cooling, essentially, in the summertime. Not typically used, typically we put it on April and run it through maybe August or early September. And it's basically to reduce the heat load in the greenhouse. And typically during that time, we have enough natural light that it's not an issue. We use anywhere from 30 to 50 or 60% shade over top of the greenhouse, or it can be inside the greenhouse. You'll see this at John's as well, and you can have a system where you can pull it, and A lot of these are automated. They're computer controlled based on the light level outside. It can shade the greenhouse when it needs to. The other thing is a lot of these are combination screens. In other words, they will shade in the summertime, but they're also made so that they will be essentially a thermal blanket in the wintertime. So for example, John's is the dual use, and he will pull it in basically at dark in the wintertime, and then he is basically eliminating a lot of this area above the crop from the heating. He doesn't have to heat all of that. He also doesn't lose all of that heat through the greenhouse. Has the main source of the main place of loss of heat in the greenhouse is straight out the roof. So he's stopping that. So this is a very big energy efficiency tool. So you'll see that at John's as well. Air circulation, you will be able to keep those leaf surfaces dry. So you've got the 5-minute warning. So basically you're going to promote uniform growth if you can keep the temperature and the humidity uniform in the greenhouse. You will also reduce disease. I want to mention vertical fans. These are at red sun, and they grow the plants, 15 feet tall? They're huge there. And these are fans at the top that blow that air down to the bottom so they can get that air through the entire canopy. More typically what you'll see, basically bad management of humidity and temperature gives you poor growth, extremely poor germination, and it's just, you don't want to go there. Well, I thought I had another picture here. The other thing I wanted to mention was we're seeing more fans that essentially look like they're commercial ceiling fans, and you'll see these at John's. And we're seeing a lot more of those in use instead of the, this is called a horizontal airflow fan, and there's a design for keeping a circular pattern of air moving in your greenhouse. But now you'll see the vertical fans at John's place this afternoon, and you'll see a lot more of those because it gets more air moving. And we'll talk about why that's a good thing when we get out there. All right. I want to mention just diseases in hydroponics. And I want to talk about this in terms of host, pathogen, and environment. In some cases, we can choose resistant hosts that are resistant to certain diseases, but a lot of times we really don't have that option. You're growing what the market demands, and it may not be the one that is most resistant. Pathogens, typically for foliar diseases, they're kind of always there, especially Chris mentioned gray mold, botrytis, that's just everywhere. So there are a lot of things you can't really control the infection, the pathogen itself. So what we're left with is controlling the environment. And you can do a lot with environment. Botrytis, for example, the gray mold, the infection is favored by cool, high humidity conditions. This is just an example of it's just a fungus that gets gray mess all over. And it's favored by this cool conditions. Fungal diseases in the greenhouse, the foliar diseases, are again caused by or favored by weak wetness, high humidity, poor air circulation. Crowded plants are more susceptible because you have less airflow. Dense plants are more susceptible because you have less airflow. And this would include your powdery mildew. Powdery mildew develops best at relative humidities of 95%, warm days and cool nights. Again, you can reduce or prevent powdery mildew by reducing humidity and increasing air circulation for just about all of these diseases. Increase air circulation and reduce humidity. Bacterial diseases, the same thing. Minimize wetness, reduce the humidity, maximize the airflow. We have no chemical controls for those. So just in summary, reduce the relative humidity either by venting and heating or by using your horizontal airflow fans. Keep the surfaces dry and improve that circulation. And of course, good sanitation, that's kind of a no-brainer. Anything that's diseased, put it in a bag before you carry it through the greenhouse. Don't pick it up in one end and carry it to the trash can in the other. Carry bags with you, put it in the bag, close the bag, then take it to the trash can. So again, for the greenhouse and the environment, we're really talking about optimum growing conditions, and that's your job as a grower, is to establish and maintain those optimum growing conditions. And to be aware, your crop is happy or it's not, and you need to recognize that. If it's not happy, you need to be figuring out as quick as you can what the reason for that is so that you can correct it before you have permanent damage. Okay? My contact information, and I also given you the This is a website we set up when we did a greenhouse vegetables program. It wasn't specific to hydroponics, but it has a lot more on site selection and greenhouse production, greenhouse selection, and construction. So I'll give you that website for future. And we will probably put the materials from this workshop on the site as well. Any questions? Yeah.
At our greenhouse, we have the full cell wet wall, and we have home ventilation in our greenhouse. But we also face a lot of powder and mildew issues. We're talking about using the wet wall to cool down the greenhouse, but at the same time, it's also creating a lot of moisture. I wonder if you have any solutions to that.
That is an issue, especially in the summertime. Yeah, because you are pulling the air through there, and you are humidifying it. Really, the only thing is just to keep air moving and treat anything, remove anything that is showing the disease, and try to treat preventatively with some of the fungicides. Yeah, if you've got a really bad problem with it, or a crop that's really susceptible to it, it could be a real issue in the summertime. Humidity control in Virginia is really something we can only do in the shoulder seasons of the winter.
Do you recommend a dehumidifier?
It'd be very expensive. I mean, you could try a dehumidifier, but it would be very expensive. They do make some commercially for greenhouses, but they are pretty expensive.
Do you have a list of businesses or individuals that will do consultations or rec greenhouses?
That will do a list of people who do help you build a greenhouse?
Yeah.
One of the resources that it's on this page is a extension publication called Resources for Greenhouse and Nursery Operators, and all of the companies that deal with greenhouses are listed on there. And what I recommend to people is to start with the hort distributors, places like Griffin Greenhouse or Maryland Plants and Supplies. These are local people that you will deal with on a continuous basis. I think BFG and Harrisonburg is another one that you might want to talk to. They may not necessarily have their own greenhouse construction crews. Griffin does, but I don't think Maryland Plants or BFG does. But they have ones that they work with. And I recommend you interview them, you have them come out, give you your ideas, and see who you want to work with. Because setting up that relationship is going to be a good start.
And where's that information on your?
It's on the extension site, but you'll also find it on this this website right here. Or if you want to drop me a card, I'd be happy to send it to you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yes. One more.
Regarding to other mildew, what is your experience with peroxide from rabbits?
My experience with which?
Peroxide or oxidase?
I am not a plant pathologist, so I have no experience with these chemicals on powdery mildew. We do have some excellent resources at Virginia Tech that can help with that. So if you have those issues persistently, give me a call and I'll connect you with the right people. Okay. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Neil.